There is a particular quality to the kind of collapse that does not happen in a single moment. It is less dramatic than the sudden fall, and in some ways more devastating because the person inside it has time to watch it happen and to tell themselves at each individual stage that this stage is manageable, that the next one might be different, that the ground has stopped shifting, and the new baseline is where things will stabilize. The gradual collapse is the one where every increment taken alone seems survivable, and the full picture only becomes visible when enough of them have accumulated that looking away from it is no longer possible. That is the collapse that has been happening to Andrew Mountbatten Windsor. Not a single catastrophic moment that anyone could point to and say, that is where it ended, a series of them. Accumulating across years, each one rearranging the landscape around him in ways that he appears to have been consistently unable to fully accept until the next rearrangement arrived and made the previous one seem, by comparison, like the stable period. Marsh Farm is where the accumulation has arrived in its most concrete and most visible form. A 5-bedroom farmhouse in Norfolk, part of the Sandringham estate, surrounded by security fencing recently installed, undergoing renovations that were necessary before anyone could reasonably occupy the space, sitting in countryside that is, by any objective measure, genuinely beautiful but that is not Windsor Great Park and is not Royal Lodge, and is not any version of the physical world that Andrew has inhabited since birth. His reaction when he first visited the property, still mid-renovation, still incomplete, still carrying all the visual evidence of a place that had not recently been treated as somewhere that mattered, that reaction has been described by sources in terms that tell you more about where he is psychologically than any amount of formal analysis could manage. Not resignation, not even disappointment in the ordinary sense. Incredulity, the response of a man confronting something he could see in front of him, but had not, at some level that was more fundamental than the intellectual one, quite believed was going to be what he was facing. Talk emerged from people close to the situation about vermin concerns, maintenance deficiencies, an overall impression that fell dramatically short of his expectations. And those specific complaints are revealing precisely because of what they reveal about the expectations they are being measured against. Vermin and maintenance issues are problems that any farmhouse that has been empty for several years might be expected to present. They are practical problems with practical solutions, the kind that a renovation process is specifically designed to address. Andrew's reaction to them as though they were disqualifying conditions, as though the existence of these problems in a property he had not yet moved into, was itself an argument against the entire arrangement, tells you something about the specific relationship between his sense of what he is entitled to and the reality of what the institution has concluded is appropriate for his current circumstances. The contrast he is living inside is not subtle and does not require extensive elaboration to be understood. Royal Lodge was 30 rooms, Windsor Great Park. Centuries of aristocratic heritage embedded in the physical fabric of the property, grounds manicured to a standard that reflects the accumulated investment of generations. Rooms filled with the accumulated weight of privilege in its most material form, the kind of place that communicates, simply by existing in the way it exists, that the person living inside it belongs to a specific category of human experience. That the world has been organized around their comfort in ways that are taken for granted rather than noticed. Marsh Farm is functional. Practical, adequate. Those words, functional, practical, adequate, are not words that have defined any aspect of Andrew's existence in his entire adult life. They are the vocabulary of ordinary life, of life lived within the ordinary constraints of ordinary circumstances, and they belong to a universe that is genuinely foreign to a man who has never, at any point, been required to inhabit it. The distance between Royal Lodge and Marsh Farm is not primarily a distance of miles. It is a distance of the entire imaginative and practical world that the two properties represent. And Andrew is being required to cross that distance not as a voluntary adventure into a simpler life, but as the direct consequence of choices made across decades that have produced this specific outcome. The financial arithmetic that underlies the relocation is worth examining clearly, because it explains why the move from Royal Lodge was not negotiable in the way that Andrew's resistance to it might have implied he believed it was. Maintaining Royal Lodge required considerable resources, security provisions for a former senior royal at a 30-room estate. Staff of 28 people, grounds maintenance, general upkeep, all of it requiring ongoing expenditure that had been absorbed for years by the institutional machinery that surrounds royal life. King Charles, by the accounts that have emerged from those familiar with his thinking, grew weary of the arrangement, not because of any sudden calculation, but because of the gradual accumulating recognition that the expenditure was being made in support of a lifestyle that no longer corresponded to any institutional function. Andrew was generating no return for the institution. His presence within the royal framework was a pure cost with no offsetting benefit. The funds were going to stop, the lease arrangements were going to shift, and the machinery of royalty that had absorbed every cost without complaint for decades was going to present, for the first time, something resembling an invoice. What happened next, the gradual, methodical, spectacle-free repositioning that has brought Andrew from Royal Lodge to Wood Farm Cottage to Marsh Farm, is the answer that the institution gave to the question of what happens when the invoice arrives and the person responsible for it cannot pay. The answer was not a dramatic expulsion or a formal banishment or any of the theatrical mechanisms that the drama of the situation might have suggested. It was incremental. Staff reductions happening quietly, invitations to family gatherings becoming less frequent and more perfunctory. The security detail scaling back from a visible assertion of standing to something resembling a courtesy, each adjustment appearing minor in isolation. Taken together, composing a portrait of systematic removal so gradual that by the time the full picture emerged, the outcome was already inevitable and the moment to resist it had long since passed. This is how the monarchy handles its thorniest problems. Not with proclamations or formal announcements or theatrical moments of rupture that would themselves become the story and require the institution to manage them as such. With accountings. With the slow withdrawal of subsidies and invitations and the various forms of institutional support whose presence had been so normalized that their absence only becomes fully visible after enough of them have been removed. The monarchy is preserving itself by shedding what it can no longer afford to carry, and it is doing so with a discipline and a patience that is specifically designed to avoid the kind of public confrontation that a more decisive action might produce. Andrew's response to this process, the frustration, the pushback, the behavior that sources describe as resembling petulance, tells you that he understood what was happening before he was ready to accept it. The Newsnight interview of 2019 was the inflection point that permanently altered his trajectory. The decision to sit down with Emily Maitlis, against the advice of every professional in his orbit, and to attempt to explain his association with Jeffrey Epstein in a format that he apparently believed his own charm and confidence could carry, that decision produced consequences that were both immediate and irreversible. Within weeks, the official royal duties were gone. Within months, the institutional departure was clearly permanent. Within years, the systematic stripping of every formal marker of his royal status was complete. And yet through all of it, Royal Lodge remained. He stayed embedded within the physical landscape of royal life, sheltered by the facade of a normality that was becoming progressively less normal with every passing development in the broader Epstein story. The property was the last remaining visible symbol of a position that had otherwise ceased to exist. As long as he was in Royal Lodge, the argument could be made, implicitly and without words, that he still occupied royal space. That whatever had happened to his titles and his patronages and his public role, the institution still recognized him as someone who belonged in its geography. Marsh Farm ends that argument. The 5-bedroom farmhouse in Norfolk does not communicate belonging to the royal geography. It communicates the specific distance that the institution has decided is appropriate between Andrew's circumstances and the physical heart of royal life. And the renovation that was necessary before anyone could occupy the space, the rewiring, the plastering, the asbestos remediation, the pest control, communicates something additional about how seriously his comfort and his preferences have been weighted in the planning of this arrangement. The property needed work before it could be lived in. The work was done. He was expected to be grateful for the work and to move in. His reaction suggests that gratitude was not what arrived. The public indifference that has settled around this story is, in its own way, more damaging to Andrew than any tabloid headline could be at this stage. When his troubles first surfaced in 2019, they commanded attention. They provoke debate and outrage, and the specific kind of moral engagement that public scandals generate when people believe the subject still matters enough to be worth being angry about. Now the relocation to a farmhouse in Norfolk barely registers as news. The British public has absorbed the scandal, rendered its verdict, and largely turned its attention elsewhere. Andrew's existence at Marsh Farm is a footnote. And for a man whose entire identity was constructed around significance, around being seen and being relevant and mattering within the national conversation, that shift from outrage to indifference, the specific move from hatting him to simply not thinking about him, may wound more deeply than any specific criticism ever did. The isolation that has gathered around him compounds the indifference. Sarah Ferguson, who maintained an unwavering presence in his sphere through decades of post-divorce cohabitation, projecting solidarity and sharing the physical space of Royal Lodge through everything that the family and the institution threw at them, that arrangement appears to have reached its limit. She is in the Austrian Alps. He is in Norfolk. The partnership that outlasted the marriage by 20 years has apparently been overcome by circumstances that even the specific bond between two people who understood each other's worlds completely has not been able to absorb. If the reports of her separate trajectory prove accurate, Andrew finds himself in a position he may never have seriously contemplated. Not just removed from the institution, not just diminished in his public standing, but genuinely and practically alone in a way that his post-divorce life never required him to be. Beatrice and Eugenie have built their own lives with the specific care of people who understand that proximity to their father's situation carries a cost they are unwilling to absorb indefinitely. They love him. That is not in doubt and should not be characterized as such. But they have recognized something he appears unable to accept. That the best thing they can do for themselves and for their children is to build identities and lives that stand on their own merits rather than being defined by his circumstances. Their visits are described as affectionate but measured. The affection is real. The measurement is the product of a calculation that a person who has never been required to make practical calculations about association and proximity might not understand. The speculation about a possible overseas relocation to Bahrain, where Andrew has established connections, or some other location where the royal history retains a social currency that has been largely exhausted in Britain, adds another layer of uncertainty to a situation that is already deeply unresolved. Whether Sandringham represents a permanent arrangement or a waypoint on a longer journey is a question that nobody outside the innermost circles of Andrew's decision-making can currently answer with confidence. What can be said is that the conditions for a settled, sustainable existence in Britain, the institutional support, the social acceptance, the ongoing legal situation, the public regard that might make a private life in his home country feel viable, are not currently present in a form that suggests long-term stability. The question that sits at the end of this story at this particular stage of it is the one the source material poses directly. Will Andrew ultimately reconcile himself to the diminished reality surrounding him, or will he keep searching for some avenue back toward the significance and validation that defined his earlier life? History provides a reasonably consistent answer to that question when applied to people who have inhabited power and privilege for as long and as completely as Andrew has. The instinct is rarely reconciliation. It is more typically the continued search, the ongoing negotiation, the clinging to whatever fragments of the former reality remain available while the world continues to rearrange itself around an absence that Andrew himself refuses to fully acknowledge. The rooms have grown smaller. The invitations have largely stopped. The authority has evaporated. The staff are 3 rather than 28. The property is a farmhouse rather than a mansion. And the world outside those renovated walls continues turning with a rhythm that is not organized around Andrew's presence in it, and that has not been organized around it for years, and that shows no signs of reorganizing itself around it at any point in the foreseeable future. He is at Marsh Farm. The renovation is complete. The fence is up. The cameras are installed. And the question of whether the man inside has accepted the reality of what that means, genuinely accepted it, at the level that would allow something resembling a settled existence to begin, remains, as it has remained through every previous stage of this long and extraordinary story, unanswered. The ground beneath him shifted. Increment by increment, decision by decision, institution by institution. And the farmhouse in Norfolk is where the shifting has arrived, for now in its most concrete and most visible form. Whether it is a destination or a waypoint is the question. Whether acceptance arrives before the next rearrangement does is the question underneath that one. And Andrew, standing somewhere in the completed farmhouse, surrounded by new carpets and security cameras, and the quiet that does not heal but only waits, is the only person who can answer either of them. And he has not answered yet.